Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. For those who may not know me, my name is President Andrea Chapdelaine, and I serve as the president of this wonderful institution, Hood College. I want to welcome all of you, at least virtually, to our beautiful campus, as you can see in my background, and to this evening for the Hanson Lecture Series at Hood College. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Janice Black. I hope she's here with us. She is the CEO and president of the Foundation for Enhancing Communities, which supports this lecture series, which was established by Robert and Barbara Hanson to support events here, both at Hood College and at Gettysburg. This lecture series, since its inception, has established a rich tradition of bringing amazing speakers, inspirational, thoughtful speakers to our campus. And certainly tonight is no exception to that. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Allen as she spoke to myself and a group of fellow presidents of private higher education institutions. And after hearing her talk and the conversation that we had with her, I said, I have to bring her to Hood. When I heard her, I was just so inspired and moved by how deeply she spoke to the mission of an institution like Hood. It was as if she knew our mission to empower our students to use their heart, minds, and hands to meet the responsibilities of meeting our challenges of our world, and really embodies our values of hope, opportunity, obligation, and democracy, as I am sure you will hear. I also wanted to say a thank you to Dr. William Allen, another Allen here with us, who is our visiting assistant professor of philosophy, who helped organize this event, along with helping with the sponsorship from our NEH Center for Humanities. And then finally, I want to thank and introduce Dr. Katie Robiadek, who is also here with us on the panel. She is an assistant professor of political science here at Hood College, and she is also serving as the director of the Martha Church Center for Civic Engagement, which was started when Hood was celebrating its 125th anniversary a few years back, to more deeply interconnect the work of our community efforts with the curriculum and with what is going on in the classroom, and really help live that mission that I just mentioned. So I want to thank Katie for also helping sponsor this event with the center, and now turn it over to her to begin our evening. Again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, President Chapdelaine, for setting us up for an important and timely conversation tonight. It's my great pleasure, both as a fellow political theorist and someone whose undergraduate major was called Political Theory and Constitutional Democracy, to introduce Dr. Danielle Allen as our speaker tonight. Before I do that, though, I want to say a word about the format of this webinar. After Dr. Allen's remarks, I'll ask some questions before opening up the floor for attendee questions. So attendees, please type your questions into the Q&A using that button at the bottom of your screens. Dr. William Allen, our NEH Sophia Libman Professor of the Humanities here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Hood College, as you heard just mentioned by President Chapdelaine, who's really made this event happen. He'll be the one to moderate the public Q&A session for us. So without further ado, Dr. Danielle Allen is James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and Director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics there. She's an award-winning political theorist who's published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. Among many publications, her books on justice and citizenship in both the city of Athens in ancient Greece, as well as the modern United States, are known widely and include the prize-winning title, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, which is based on readings of the Declaration she held with both adult night students and University of Chicago undergraduates. The result is an exploration of the Declaration's positive argument for equality in light of its contradictory liberation of some people while subjugating slaves and Native Americans. This contradiction has been explored here at Hood College recently in the Department of Political Science's own series on race, politics, and public policy, coordinated by our own Dr. Tamlin Tucker Wargs, for which we're grateful. Dr. Allen's passion for democratic citizenship is also evidenced in her role as the principal investigator for the Democratic Knowledge Project, aiming to understand the knowledge, the skills, and the capacities that democratic citizens, many of us here included, need in order to succeed at operating their democracy. As chair of the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, she even oversaw the recent 2020 release of a bipartisan report titled Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. Dr. Allen will talk about sustaining democracy through the liberal arts tonight, which is a topic near and dear to many hearts here in our very own liberal arts community at Hood College, a campus whose stated values, you heard from President Chapdelaine, are hope, opportunity, obligation, and democracy itself. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Allen. We look forward to your expert remarks.
Thank you so much, Professor Robiedek and President Chapdelaine. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening and an honor to be in a place with those values. You're right, President Chapdelaine, that I think my values and the values of Hood College are very closely aligned. I do bring a love of democracy to all of my work. And so I imagine that you, like me, share a sense of concern or distress even about where we are in the state of our history in this country. For many people, January 6th was a sort of moment of incredible awakening to the depths of our difficulties, a sense that we really have reached a kind of pivot point in our history. In my own case, in all honesty, my worry about our democracy goes back further. I've been worried for the last few years because of data that indicates that young people don't necessarily hold democracy in high regard or don't have great esteem for it. The relevant data point that caught my attention a few years ago was one you may have heard as well, that for the generation born before World War II, roughly 70% consider it essential to live in a democracy. In contrast, for people who are 40 or younger, not quite 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. That's a remarkable change. And the simple fact of the matter is you can't have a democracy if people don't want it. So if we're down to only 30% of a generational cohort considering it essential to live in a democracy, that is a major warning bell for the future of our society. Somehow or other, we haven't achieved one of those fundamental human needs, generational succession, in terms of understanding and commitment to a way of life that we've forged in this country. That data point, though, too, wasn't my sort of first alarm bell for my worry about democracy. That alarm bell rang for me in 2013 when Congress had an approval rating of 9%. All right, now we know Congress's approval rating is still not very high in the 20%, but it actually hit 9%. This is fundamental. If you go back to the origins of democratic theory in the 1600s and 1700s, when people were trying for the first time to really imagine what it meant to organize politics flowing from the will of the people, the argument made by political philosophers of that day was that achieving free self-government for free and equal citizens required recognizing that power can be split into three parts. There's the power of willing, of setting a direction for society, or the legislative power. Then there's the power of executing on that direction, bringing it into action, the executive power. And then there's the power of judging the relationship between the law and the execution of the law, and that's the judicial power. And as I say that, you'll be recognizing my sketch of the three branches of our own government. In that account of power that came from the 1600s and 1700s, it was very clear that the legislative branch was the first branch of government. The reason it was the first branch was because it had the job of articulating the will of the people. If you want to design a system of government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people, you have to start by making sure that the people's voice shapes the whole government. So the legislature, full of our representatives, is our voice. When we hit a point where we, the people, approve of Congress at the rate of 9%, it means we, the people, don't approve of our own voice. And when that happens, then you know your constitutional democracy is fundamentally broken. So breakage has been underway for a while. And there are lots of causes of the weakening of our system of constitutional democracy, the erosion of governance, the rise of polarization. Some of this is about changes in economic policy and the way in which power actually has moved away from Congress and to things like the Federal Reserve. So Congress doesn't have as much authority as it did at prior points. As a result, in the vacuum of its authority, Congress starts to engage in more fighting over wedge issues, cultural politics, and the like, and then that is a driver of polarization. There are other features too that have led us to the point where our political institutions are weakened from a governance point of view. But for now, let me just note that that weakening has occurred. And it's not as if it was actually just the product of this past year. It's not just the pandemic. It's not just that we are currently living through an incredible fight against racial inequities and injustices. The weakening of our system of governance has really been underway for some time. For me, this is a deep cause of concern. I carry an abiding love of democracy. People often ask me why, why, Danielle, do you love democracy so much? It sort of seems kind of weird. You actually seem to feel emotionally connected to the concept of democracy. I do feel emotionally connected to the concept of democracy. And I actually have a really hard time answering just exactly where that comes from. I know to some extent it comes from my family. I grew up in a family that cared a lot about individual people achieving empowerment. And they recognized that empowerment isn't just about being able to set things right in your own space, in your own home, with your own family. They understood that empowerment is also about contributing to the shape of the communities we live in. After all, our communities set constraints on our way of life, on our possibilities, on the horizons of our imagination. So if we're going to be truly empowered, we need to contribute to shaping those constraints so that we are also the authors of the life our community establishes as the boundaries for our experience. W.E.B. Du Bois called that recognition the aspiration to be a co-creator in the kingdom of culture. We all desire to be a creator of our own life, again, in our own garden, in our family, in our house, in our home. But then there's an additional aspiration to be a co-creator in the kingdom of culture, to join together with others in the shaping of that world in which we live together. So my family recognized that. They had that understanding of empowerment, that aspiration. My grandfather on my dad's side helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida, which was absolutely a bid for emancipation and freedom and true democracy. And on my mom's side, my great-grandparents in Michigan fought for women's right to vote in the beginning of the 20th century. So I know deep in my family history, my DNA, there is that love of democracy. In my own life, again, I try to answer sort of where did it come from? When did I become aware of loving democracy? And I think it's pretty basic. I think just as a child in various ways, I had some experiences of bullying. And my response to that was to develop a very strong allergy to bullying. And in some sense, you could think of democracy as the antidote to bullying. The entire purpose of democracy is to make sure that none of us is ever subject to bullying. So democracy, at the end of the day, is this extraordinary human invention that has the job of protecting us all from bullying, whether by other people around us or by institutions of power. And it is also a system of empowerment where it gives us the opportunity to be not just creators of our own small world, but co-creators of the world we share with others. So I think that's where my love of democracy comes from. And as I said, I've been watching these features in our collective life, and they set off warning bells. I worry deeply about whether or not constitutional democracy is something that we can sustain for future generations. Out of that worry, I had the chance to take action. And I think often that is the way life goes. You have a worry, but you have an aspiration for something, and you chart a path of action from worry to aspiration. And in my case, the opportunity for action that I had came from an invitation to chair a commission. Professor Roby Adek mentioned this, a commission sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I want to tell you a little something about the Academy, because It relates to this issue of how the liberal arts are critical to the long-term health of democracy. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences was founded in 1780, so still in the middle of the American Revolution. The war was still going on. The purpose of the Academy was to bring together representatives of the learned professions. That was the 18th century language for people who knew stuff, doctors and lawyers and academics and professors and ministers and the like, people who knew stuff, the learned professions. And the people who founded the Academy and wanted to bring together these representatives of the learned professions were the revolutionaries. It was John Hancock, John Adams. Two of the first members were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. Why did they think it was so important to come together in the form of an academy, a learned society? They understood that the new form of government that they were inventing would require knowledge resources. And they wanted to make sure that this new country would be equipped with a group of people who would always be standing by, ready to dig in to study and consideration and learning and science in order to answer the questions, urgent questions of the moment put before the new country. And so indeed, there I was a few years ago, a member of the Academy, and the then president of the Academy, Jonathan Fanton, called me and said, I'm worried about our democracy. I think we need a commission to really study the question of what's happening with our democracy and what to do about it. And so we assembled a group, about 35 people. We covered the disciplines. There you go. That's the liberal arts, all the different subjects. We needed political science, and we needed law. We needed history. We needed sociology. We also needed people from the world. We had philanthropists and people from the business sector and people who run nonprofit organizations in different parts of the country. And we sought out demographic diversity because we needed diversity of perspective as well, because no single perspective is big enough to capture the whole of trying to understand a hard problem. We also sought out political diversity, viewpoint diversity as we assembled this group. And we set ourselves the task of asking the question, answering the question, what are the challenges that are faced by democratic citizens right now? Why is there disaffection and alienation from our democracy? And what can we do about it? We worked for about 2 years. We ran listening sessions all over the country, engaging ordinary Americans of all kinds, from naval cadets to people who work in civil rights and advocacy organizations in Southern California, groups of immigrants and refugees to this country. We engage voters, we engage non-voters, a whole range of people. And we heard some really similar things across these groups. We heard a worry about breakage, about erosion. We heard a worry that Americans don't share anything with each other. So that was an interesting irony, that the one thing we share is that we are afraid we don't share anything. Well, it's actually something we share. We also heard an astonishing love of country from everybody. People had different reasons for loving the country. Lots of people have criticisms of the country. And just the way in our family, we can have people that we criticize and we love, people were able to put those things together. But there was this love of country everywhere. And there was an appetite for figuring out what we need to do to restore our collective commitment to our democracy. The sense of alienation flowed from the fact that people experience our political institutions as not responsive, not delivering solutions to the problems people see, as leaving people feeling disempowered, as leaving people feeling not equally represented. So there's a cluster of problems with our political institutions. And then there were worries about our civil society, that we don't have enough opportunities to bridge difference and to meet people who are unlike ourselves and learn from their perspective. There were worries about our media ecosystem and the problems of misinformation and disinformation. And then there was this really significant worry about the fact that we just plain don't know how to talk about our relationship with each other anymore in this country. There was sort of big fight about, should we describe what we're trying to do together as patriotism? Should we talk about it as solidarity? What exactly is it that should link us together? So we learned that there is a need to do work on the question of how to nourish and rebuild a sense of mutual commitment of all of us to one another and shared commitment to our constitutional democracy. So we started trying to put together a set of recommendations that would help us all build toward a virtuous circle in which we reform our institutions to make them more responsive, more empowering, deliver better representation for people, invest in our civil society so that it can help people bridge differences and give us a civic media ecosystem, not a social media ecosystem. So not being trapped in middle school forever with bullying and trolling, but an information ecosystem that supports healthy public and civic discourse. And then we wanted to work on our culture as well with investments in civic education. This is last part I'm really going to talk about for the rest of my time, because this is really where the liberal arts come into play. So institutions, civil society, culture, we need all of those things working together in a healthy way, in a virtuous cycle. And as I say all of this and begin to point a path toward how we acquire a healthy democracy, there's something that you should be registering. It probably sounds a little hard. It probably sounds a little abstract. And I could make it less abstract by giving you examples of concrete recommendations. We think that we should increase the size of Congress. We think that we should give Supreme Court justices term limits. We think that we should apply some regulations to our social media companies to ensure that they make space for public media and public media engagements. I could give you a list of concrete things. But even if I did that, I think you're probably still registering that this does all sound complex and abstract. You're right to register that. And this is where I want to get to the fundamental point. Democracy is intellectually demanding, okay? And we can understand this in a very, very basic way. If you're trying to teach a kid, for example, what a monarchy is, it's very easy. You find a picture of a king or a queen, you point to the picture and you say, that person makes the rules and everybody has to do what they say. That's what a monarchy is. And you can do the same thing with an aristocracy or an oligarchy. You say, okay, here's a group of people, here are their pictures, they make the rules, everybody has to do what they say. Now, but this democracy concept, all right, now go back to the Greek and it literally means the power of the people. How do you explain this to a kid? I can't point to a picture of the people and say that's who's in charge. Democracy by definition demands abstraction. The people has to be turned through institutions into a set of decision-making structures. And on top of that, not only do we need that abstraction to understand what democracy is, but in order to take a part in this, we all have to learn stuff. We have to learn how to vote. We have to learn how to serve on committees. We have to learn how to run committees. That means we have to learn how to talk to each other. We have to learn how to be persuasive with our words. We have to learn how to process an incredible diversity of viewpoints and information coming from all over. Democracy is really intellectually demanding. So democracies don't just fall from the sky like manna. They don't just flow down the mountains like a river stream. They are things that human beings have to build and cultivate over time by building and cultivating the knowledge and understanding and capacities for judgment that sustain and nourish democracies. So civic education is fundamental to the long-term life and health of a democracy. And the content of an education that delivers the foundation for democracy is the liberal arts. They're called that for a reason, right? The liberal word is the free arts, arts for free people. And that's where you've got history and literature and philosophy and religion and science, and they all come together. Because in order to be a free person, thinking about the direction of your society and contributing to discussions, you need to understand something about the context, the course of human events everybody's living through. You need to be able to develop a set of pictures about prescriptions or directions you'd like to go. That's really thinking about religion and values and ethics and philosophy. You have to understand human beings, because when we design our political institutions, what we are doing is trying to combine how we organize the incentives that organize human behavior with the culture, the norms, the principles that we start to adhere to because we believe in them. A combination of incentive structures and beliefs is what gives our society the shape it has. And to get that right, to know how to design institutions, to know how to foster and support democracy supportive norms, you've got to understand people. And that's literature, it's anthropology, it's sociology. All right. So all of the body of knowledge that you need to build and operate a democracy resides in the liberal arts. Wow. How are we doing on that front? Let me just start with the K-12 space. And then what we know about K-12 to some extent flows through to the higher ed arena as well. In the K-12 context, we currently invest, in terms of federal dollars, $50 per kid per year in STEM fields and 5 cents per kid per year in civics. Okay. So we have a very skewed investment between investment in science and technology, engineering, and math, and investment in the kind of stuff, the liberal arts, that supports democracy. We need those STEM investments, but we need both and. We need to get those civics investments, investments in the humanities and social sciences, investments in the liberal arts up to the same level as our STEM investments. So how exactly did we come to this point of having this really skewed investment? Let me just tell you the story of this, and then I'll reach the end of my remarks, and we'll really look forward to the conversation. The story here goes back to World War II. During World War II, this country faced a dire threat. The world knew that the Germans were in pursuit of an atom bomb, and that such a thing would be of immense power and change the balance of the war. There was an imperative to accelerate the pace of scientific research to beat the Germans in the production of such a bomb. The way this was achieved was via the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was spearheaded by the then president of Harvard, James Bryant Conant. And what the Manhattan Project consisted of was massive federal investment in the nation's research universities to accelerate that scientific work necessary to develop an atom bomb. And that was the beginning of consistent, continuous federal investment in research universities in the sciences specifically. The reason for those investments was in order to achieve national security for the country as a whole. Those investments in STEM fields were extended and expanded into K-12 in the 1950s when the Soviet Union beat the US in launching a satellite into space, the Sputnik space satellite. When that happened, again, this country was worried about falling behind in a race for scientific technology, so invested in STEM education. In the 1980s, we had another round of concern about our competitiveness on the global stage. In the 1980s, our concern was not so much with national security, understood in that military sense, but rather with economic competitiveness. And once again, the diagnosis was that in order to compete economically with, for example, Japan's rising economy, we really needed to invest in STEM education to keep ourselves competitive on that global stage. And that's the story of what happened with our national investments in education. We have over 50 years consistently increased our investment in STEM education while slowly allowing our investments in civics and social studies and humanities to decline. But the fact of the matter is, if we're going to compete on the global stage, and it's reasonable, of course, that we should want to compete on the global stage, we ought to want to do that as the kind of society that we are, and that is as a constitutional democracy. That means a true concept of competitiveness would require that we invest in civic strength, in all of the resources that we need to preserve a healthy constitutional democracy for all of us, a truly inclusive constitutional democracy for the first time. And that means it's time to renew our commitment to civic education, to renew our commitment to the liberal arts. Those of you who are on a liberal arts journey on a higher education campus are already doing work on behalf of democracy. But I think you probably also know that you're in the minority in terms of what people value in the world right now in thinking about education. And so we have to make the case for the liberal arts again. We have to make the case that it is foundational to civic strength that people be educated in the disciplines that permit them to function effectively as citizens and civic participants in a constitutional democracy. So we have good reason to be worried about the health of our constitutional democracy. Young people have good reason to be disaffected and to lack esteem for our democracy. We have a lot we need to fix. Our institutions need to work better. They need to be more responsive, more empowering. We need to address issues of equity and fairness. We need a healthy civil society. We need to rebuild a culture of mutual commitment. We do need all of those things. In order to achieve them, one of the most important things we need is renewed understanding of the importance of civic education to democracy. And as a part of that, we need fundamentally a renewed importance of the value of the liberal arts as a foundation, a necessary foundation for a healthy constitutional democracy. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Can't wait to hear your questions and looking forward to talking with Professor Robiedek now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. I know that many of our attendees are as moved as I am by your remarks and this call to action that you're presenting for us. And so I just want to kick us off with the question that your remarks at the end leave us with: should there be a standard national civic education curriculum?
So
If
I
so,
don't think there should be a national curriculum. I am on the record as thinking that we don't need a national curriculum. I am, however, on the record of thinking that we do need a shared national framework. Now that might sound like, words where there's not much difference, but let me try to articulate what that difference is. I just had the great good fortune to participate in a large project called Educating for American Democracy that released a roadmap in early March about how to rebuild excellence in history and civics learning for all learners K through 12. And what we did in that roadmap was lay out a set of themes that we think every learner should encounter across a K through 12 journey. And then what we did is beneath each theme, lay out a set of questions that we think every learner should have the chance to encounter. So it's an inquiry framework. And so what we are really doing is inviting the nation's community of educators to experiment, to enter into a shared community of practice where we're engaged in the same conversation, but the specific form that a curriculum will take in a given state, in a given district, will vary with context as people make decisions about how best to move that conversation forward in their own community. We are an incredibly diverse country. We're a highly polarized country. We need to accept to some important degree that there will be diversity in our approaches to civic learning across the country. Yet we also need to find something that we can share, that we can hold on to together. And our proposal is that what we can hold on together is a set of questions. Maybe not a set of answers, not a single set of answers, but perhaps a shared set of questions.
thank you. And that really gets us to the heart of the liberal arts in a different way, this ability to formulate questions when encountering the kind of content that you were talking about earlier from different disciplines. And so really wanting to expand on this question of what it is students are doing, what skills are they using when encountering this content, this liberal arts content that then connects to, in all the ways you explained, to kind of participating in democracy and democratic self-government as free and equal and working together. So what are some of those skills specifically that you think are most important along with formulating questions?
Well, I always use the Declaration of Independence as a great touchstone for encapsulating the core content of what it means to be a citizen, what the activity of citizenship is, and therefore also what the kind of intellectual, moves are, the things that you do when you're thinking for democracy. And if you just look at the structure of that document, it starts out with a diagnosis of contemporary circumstances. It starts out with a sentence: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to separate themselves from another and so forth. But it's that concept of when in the course of human events. How do you actually know what the meaning is of the moment in which you find yourself? What is happening to your community, to your people, to your country? In order to ask that question, you have to know a lot about history. You have to be able to have also a sense of values and aspirations. What should life be like in your community? Because you need a measuring stick against which to set the actual realities. Then after they make their diagnosis, they run through, they articulate a statement of principles. They articulate those aspirations, right? The important sentence with, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now that's really where we see the work of the study of ethics and philosophy and religion and the ways in which we learn about moral questions and moral dilemmas, ethical dilemmas through literature. All of that is infusing their ability to say what matters to them and why, what their core values are. They need that to connect that with their diagnosis in order to figure out what to do. Their diagnosis then has a long list of grievances and complaints against the king. That depends, again, on the sort of well worked out set of concepts about what human beings owe each other. And then after they've gone through all of that analysis, they have a view about what they need to do. They're going to mutually pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in order to launch a war. And as a part of that war, they're going to develop treaty making power. They're going to build laws and institutions and the like. So That was a long narrative of what's in the Declaration. The Declaration itself is probably shorter than that. But at any rate, I mean, the point is there's a diagnosis of present circumstances, and that's sociology and history and political science and all of those disciplines. There's a moral statement, a statement of belief and commitment and conviction. And again, that is all of our disciplines of philosophy and religion and literature and the like. And then there's an action plan. And that action plan depends on an understanding of law and institutions and how human beings can inspire solidarity amongst themselves and form alliances and the like. And again, the disciplines of the liberal arts, psychology, we need there as well. The sciences are important too. I don't mean to leave them out in this picture. They are part of the liberal arts. We need the sciences too to diagnose the circumstances in which we find ourselves. The COVID pandemic has made that abundantly clear. Our diagnosis doesn't just depend on history, it also depends on understanding the natural world and how the natural world is changing around us. So the liberal arts taken together allow us to orient ourselves in our world, allow us to think about our responsibilities to other human beings, and allow us to chart action pathways. Those are the core things.
Wonderful. And it really brings our attention to the connection of content to our relation to that content and our, so the skills, content, dispositions, all working together capacities, which I know is interesting to the teachers and learners in the room here. And so I'll ask my last question before we open it up to the public Q&A. Going to this point that you made about citizens being able to, or students being able to clarify values throughout the process you just laid out, and sort of doing what you did at the beginning of your talk and modeling your emotional connection to democracy. So I'm just wondering a couple of things about understanding one's own values. First, if you see a role for reflection or imagination that's particularly important in cultivating this sense of narrative and creating an understanding of your commitment to a certain set of values. And then second, if cultivating that narrative or creating it is something we do better alone or with others in a democracy. So the individual versus the group process that you go through to understand what you value.
Those are beautiful questions. Thank you. Yes, I mean, we absolutely need spaces for reflection, opportunities to exercise our imagination. That is a part of developing ourselves as a whole human being. And human beings are storytellers, right? This is one of the distinctive features of us as a species, that we tell stories to one another. And as we tell stories, we are doing that work of reflection and engaging our imaginations. Yes, we tell stories about ourselves. We also tell stories about others. And the movement from I to we is a fundamental part of democratic life. And again, I think that is something that the liberal arts truly supports. An important thing, though, is I think we truly need both spaces of privacy for personal and solitary reflection and spaces of communal interaction. I think at the moment, we tend to really prioritize our connections, our community interactions, and not necessarily give ourselves enough space for private reflection. And I think that's a hard to learn, the balance between those two things, but protecting privacy for the sake of giving people places and spaces for reflection, personal experimentation, personal self-understanding is just really fundamental. So there needs to be a dynamic tension or interaction between what we do in our solitary space and then what we do with others. And the two together, I think, strengthen one another.
Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. Now I'm going to move from I to we in a different sense and turn the floor over to Dr. William Allen to lead the Q&A. Thank you again, Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Dr. Robideck, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Allen, for your comments. I'm looking at the Q&A here. You have quite a few questions. I will say we probably won't have to get to all of them, so I have to be kind of selective. But here we can expect anything less from our faculty and students here to have some pretty good questions here. All right, so here's the first one. How does anti-intellectualism fit into the ideal of the learned community? How can we push back against anti-intellectualism? How can we support the democratization of the public discourse without accepting the idea that every person's opinion is as good as anybody else's, particularly if we know that some opinions are based on the misunderstanding of well-documented, well-researched empirical facts?
Right. Yep, this is a big challenge, that's for sure. So one of the things that's striking about the US Constitution in contrast to constitutions in Europe is that there's no right to education in the US Constitution. However, there is a right to education in almost every state constitution, and we are often not aware of that fact. That right to education in our state constitutions typically grew out of a belief that the states needed to prepare people for their duties as citizens. So when you dig into the kind of jurisprudential record behind the writing of the state constitutions, that's what comes up over and over again. The reason there's a right to education in the state constitutions is because we have to actually invest through education in preparing people for effective citizenship. So that's the anchor from my point of view, that we need to restore understanding of that right in our state constitutions. What that right does is express the view, again, that we can't take democracy for granted. We do actually need to cultivate broad capacity throughout the citizenry. And so then the question is, what's the sort of fundamentals of that capacity we're trying to cultivate? Well, I mean, it really is about reason giving and argumentation and the commitment to truthfulness, a set of norms or values that we use to anchor healthy deliberation, healthy decision making. So at the end of the day, a productive civic education is not so much about information or particular facts. It really is about whether or not we can cultivate the norms of respect for evidence, understanding of argumentation, what counts as a good argument and why, commitment to that, and commitment to norms of trustworthiness. We do have a lot of work to do to rebuild those norms broadly in our culture. And I do think, again, that's why for me, really bringing up to the surface the fact that state constitutions have this right, and then asking ourselves the question of like, how can we make good on this right for all of our kids and all of our schools across the nation is a really important pathway to pursue.
Okay. Next question, and this is actually from one of my students. I think the acknowledgement that democracy is intellectually demanding is very true. But how does one ensure that all actors in democracy are able to intellectually access and understand it? With that, how can one address the potential classist divisions that may arise in certain groups who have greater opportunity to learn the intricacies of our democracy and how it works?
That's a great question. I think it goes right to the heart of the importance of educational equity and making sure that we really are putting the excellent educational opportunities in front of everybody. So that's a part of it. We definitely need to address educational inequities and fix them and get to a place where we're really delivering in a serious way for everybody. So again, I know I'm sort of a bit of a one-note Nelly on this, but this is why I'm talking so much about reinvesting in civics education. I think that is a really important equity issue, and we really need to make sure we're achieving that broadly across the country. By the same token, we also want to be realistic in our expectations. That is, I'm not suggesting that, everybody, in order to be a democratic citizen, needs to have, say, a PhD or something like that. I'm not trying to make an argument of that kind. Nor am I trying to make the case that we'll ever get to a place where people have sort of, equal degrees of investment in, logical argumentation, use of evidence, and the like. There will always be unevenness. And so that's where then thinking about the institutional design of democracy is so important. The point of the structure of representation, when it was first designed, where people come together and then elect representatives, was precisely that you would have a group of people who would have the job of filtering this huge array of opinion from all over the country. And it would be really their job to sort of sort out the wheat from the chaff and make sure the best arguments were coming to the top and then getting deliberated on in our state legislatures, in our Congress, and the like. One of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is that social media has knocked out the sort of geographic facts that require people to go through their representatives to get their arguments into the public sphere. So when the Constitution was designed, Madison, for example, thought that just the very fact of the geographic dispersal of the country meant that, if people had extreme views, they wouldn't be able to combine into kind of a faction because they'd have to go through their representatives, and their representatives would filter and mediate and kind of get thinking cleaned up for the whole society. But that whole premise, that geographic dispersal, would mean that we had to go through our representatives in order to have public arguments. That's just knocked out from under us by the invention of social media. So nothing has to be mediated any longer to make its way into public discourse. People with extreme views can find each other and form factions without having to go through representatives at all. So that's really the challenge. It's partly about education and rebuilding our norms and commitments to sort of quality of sound reasoning and sound argumentation. But it's also about whether or not we can design our institutional structures in new ways and innovate on the design so that we can restore some of that institutional capacity to mediate the quality of our discussions.
Okay. And actually, this leads to a question from one of our faculty members. And unfortunately, this will be our last question. She asked, there was a lot of initial excitement about e-democracy or the civic space that we create online. And what are your thoughts about whether social media or online activity has led to further erosion of democratic norms, especially amongst the younger generation that you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks? So maybe you'll finish, you're talking further about the online aspect of democratic participation. Yeah.
No, that's a great question. I think we have to all acknowledge, in fact, that the way social media has developed and unfolded, it has eroded democracy, partly in the way that I just described, partly in supporting and even fostering and accelerating cultures of bullying and trolling and the like. And what I have found very helpful is some work by an organization called Civic Signals, which invites us all to think about social media like cities. Once upon a time, we didn't really know how to design cities in ways that supported healthy, positive human experience and human interactions. There were no traffic lanes, there were no traffic signals, there was sort of trash all over the place, or animals and people kind of mixed up wandering all over. And over time, we developed principles of urban design. We learned how to ensure that there were green spaces in city, that there were public spaces that could be used by pedestrians and not by cars and the like. And their basic argument is that we have to go through the same learning process around digital media platforms and acquire principles of design that start to bring a healthy ecosystem into existence on those platforms. And I'll just give you one small example to make that more concrete. There is a platform based in Vermont called, I think, Front Porch, which at this point, 2/3 of the residents in Vermont participate on. And it's just sort of for sharing local news, events, garage sale information, the like. But it's effective, and you can tell that because 2/3 of the residents are on it. They're using it in a positive way. There's good engagement with it. They have a rule that you're not allowed to post more than one thing in a 24-hour period. And that simple rule just really diminishes the presence of flame wars because people just don't get engaged in a kind of toxic back and forth if you have to wait 24 hours before you sort of sling your answer back at somebody. And there are other features like that that you can sort of identify that bring a much healthier, deliberative and conversational culture into existence in a digital context. And that's sort of the work we have to do now, I think. My guess is that 10 years from now, social media is going to look completely different from how it looks now, because we will have figured out these design principles that are democracy supportive, and we will have insisted that our media platforms exhibit them.
Okay, great. At this point, we do have to conclude our talk. And Dr. Allen, I want to thank you for your comments and taking time with us. I'm sure everybody's giving a virtual applause here. I apologize that we weren't able to get to the many other questions that were put in the Q&A. But at this point, I want to once again thank our sponsor, Janice Black, from the Hanson Lecture Series through the Foundation of the Hanson Communities. I'd like to thank President Chapdelaine for her introduction, Katie Robidek with the Martha E. Church Center for Civic and Community Engagement, and Dr. Tamlin Tucker Ward from Political Science, who's been helping out as well too. That is going to conclude our talk, and everyone have a good evening.
Terrific. Thank you much. Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Okay.
Take care.